Assignment 1, Part 2. A Community Abroad, Babylon. The next major change occurred with the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. Many Jewish people now found themselves living outside Eretz Israel. Either they were taken by force, as happened to many of those taken to Babylon, present-day Iraq, or they left of their own choice, as happened to many of those who moved to Egypt. Either way, this period marked the end of a national state in Eretz Israel, and the Jewish communities in exile had to adjust to new and difficult circumstances. Let us hear about these changes from Eliashiv, one of the exiles in Babylon.
It was a terrible shock. Prophets like Jeremiah had been predicting that the temple would be destroyed if our people continued not to behave as God wanted. But none of us thought that it could happen. Solomon's temple had stood for 400 years. We had no time to think or reflect on what was happening to us. But before we knew it, we were on a march of hundreds and hundreds of kilometres to Babylon. The worst thing was listening to the mocking of the Babylonian guards. "Sing us your good old Eretz Israel songs," they said to us. "We love a good melody." The truth is that the Babylonians are not as harsh as they could have been. Yes, we are forced to live in certain areas and to work in certain jobs, but apart from that, we are left to get on with our own lives. We are trying to rebuild our communities. We are also trying to rebuild our relationship with God. Sacrifices have always been our way of making contact with God, but they can only be offered in the temple in Jerusalem. So instead, we are getting together in groups to hear God's word read to us, or to pour our hearts out to God, asking for forgiveness. Our leaders say that we must get used to the fact that we are here. God will have a way of telling us when we can go back. I do hope we can go back soon. I'm worried by what might happen to us if we stay here too long. Our culture is changing. Already we are starting to speak the local language Aramaic, and some people are giving local names to their children. My next door neighbour has a child named Zerubbabel, and he's not the only Jewish kid in town with that name. Our scribes have begun to use the fancy Babylon alphabet rather than our native Hebrew one. We're even using Babylonian names for the months. This month, for example, is called Tammuz, and Tammuz is one of the Babylonian gods. However, our Judaism is increasingly strong, and in many ways we are a self-contained community. Almost everyone follows the laws carefully. If anyone asks any of us who we are, we all immediately answer, "Jews from the land of Israel," in spite of the language, name and alphabet changes. If we ever do get the sign that we can go back to Eretz Israel, it will be interesting to see if everyone takes the opportunity. I think several people will say that life here is good enough for them and that they can live comfortably as a Jew in Babylon. After all, our community life is quite developed. Our prayer services take place in special buildings. We have our own ways of slaughtering our meat. We have our own schools and places to study. We have scribes and judges of our own, as if we live as a separate people but not in our own land. Eliashiv was right. When the Jews were allowed to return to Eretz Israel by the new Persian government, who had conquered Babylon, only a small group went back.
Eliashiv was right. When the Jews were allowed to return to Eretz Israel by the new Persian government, who had conquered Babylon, only a small group went back. The rest stayed in Babylon, laying down the roots of a diaspora community which would continue to exist for more than 2,500 years. This was a moment of great significance. It is the first time that we hear of a group of Jews who decided to stay in the diaspora and create an organised Jewish community life, despite the possibility of going back to Eretz Yisrael. Closing the doors, Ezra's controversy. Our next entry point is a century later, the 5th century BCE, in Eretz Yisrael. The community there had grown slowly around the newly built Second Temple, but the community was weak, physically and culturally. 2 men changed the situation. The first, Nehemiah, was a high official in the Persian government. On hearing that the community in Eretz Yisrael was in a very poor state, he decided to try to do something about this. With permits from the Persian emperor, he travelled to Jerusalem and started to reorganise community life. One of the most famous things he did was to rebuild the wall of the city, which had been destroyed since the Babylonian conquest. The second, Ezra, was a priest who also seemed to hold a high position in the Persian hierarchy. Ezra felt that the religious levels of the community in Eretz Yisrael had fallen badly and introduced 2 important initiatives to address this. 1. He organised a great public reading of the Torah, which had been forgotten or entirely unknown in the form that Ezra read it. In response, the people swore their loyalty to the Torah forever. 2. Reacting to the enormous amount of intermarriage which had occurred between the Jews and surrounding non-Jews, Ezra commanded all Jewish men to send their non-Jewish families away. This must have been extremely controversial. These 2 acts brought in a new phase of Jewish community. Remember that the community in Eretz Yisrael had no independent political leadership. They were part of the Persian Empire. There would be no Jewish king for many years to come. As a result, they came to see themselves as a religious community, united by God's word, the Torah, and governed by God's representatives, the priests. Let us hear from one of the Jews, Jonathan ben Asahel, who lived through these changes.
Why should I have to get rid of my family? Why should anyone be forced to do something as devastating as that? Why can I not make decisions for myself? Who are these Persian Jews, and what gives them the right to make decisions about my family? We have lived in this way for years. I can still be a good and loyal Jew without accepting the Torah as the one and only guideline for my life. Why can't each community make its own decisions about the way of life it wants to lead? And why can't each individual in a community make the same choice? Here I am being told that there is but one way for a Jew to live, and if I don't accept it, I have to leave the community and in effect stop being a Jew. Why should I accept that? Why does there have to be only one way of being, why should there only have to be one way of being Jewish, dictated by outside leaders? I am a Jew and I'm a good Jew. I helped to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem, thinking that it would strengthen our lives as a Jewish community. I have never thought that it would divide me from anyone who is not Jewish, including those that I love. I don't want to lock myself up behind a wall, either physically or metaphorically. I want to be part of the outside world as a Jew, and here are my own so-called leaders locking me up. I protest strongly.
Leaving the land, the great dilemma. Centuries passed, and in many ways the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael went from strength to strength. From a population of a few tens of thousands at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, the community numbered at least 2 million by the end of the Second Temple period, 70 CE. However, it was not only in the land of Israel that the Jewish population was growing. Jewish communities were developing in many different areas of Europe, North Africa, and the Eastern lands, as many Jews left Eretz Yisrael and decided to make their lives abroad, In the last years of the Second Temple period, between 4 and 6 million Jews lived outside the land of Israel. So more Jews lived outside than inside, during an era in which Jews were free to come and go as they pleased. This disproves the common assumption that Jews only lived abroad because they were forcibly exiled. Most Jews in this period moved because they were searching for a better quality of life. Let us listen in to a conversation between two Jews living in Eretz Yisrael in around the year 20 CE, when things were already beginning to get difficult. The Romans had been in charge of the country for about 80 years. At first, they had ruled indirectly through Jewish leaders they appointed. More recently, they had replaced the Jewish rulers with their own governors. Most Jews did not like the Romans, and eventually came to resent or even hate them. In this situation, we meet two Jewish friends, Shimon and Antigonus. Many Jews had taken on Roman names inside the land of Israel, despite the Romans' unpopularity. They both live in Antipatris, a town generally loyal to Rome, with a fair-sized Jewish community. Shimon has recently announced to his friend that he intends to leave the country and make his fortune in Alexandria, that great Egyptian city containing hundreds of thousands of Jews. Antigonus is against his plan. Shimon speaks first.
To Alexandria. It's a great city, one of the greatest in the world. We have nothing to compare to it here. Why wouldn't I want to move there? What have we got here? We don't have independence. We can't do anything without the Romans poking their nose in, and we're not in a good financial situation. The Romans impose huge taxes and then take the money themselves or send it back to Rome. I can't think of a single reason to stay here.
I understand your frustration, but your perspective is wrong. How can you turn your back on this country when it is the only place where you can live a full Jewish life? This is the place where Jewish history was made. David, Solomon, Jeremiah, Ezra, Nehemiah, the temples. Without the land, we're not a people anymore. There are things that we simply have to suffer to stay in this place. Don't allow them to push you out.
I can live just as Jewish a life in Alexandria as I can here, or anywhere else for that matter. Alexandria is a great center of Jewish culture. It was the place where the Bible was translated into Greek, so the Jews could study it in the language of the place where they live. And don't tell me that Greek isn't our language. What do we speak here in Eretz Israel among ourselves? Aramaic? And that's not a Jewish language either. How many people do you know who can hold a conversation in Hebrew today? It's true that Judaism has to meet the challenges posed by different ideas in Alexandria. In one of the world's greatest cities, with a library of hundreds and thousands of books, of course there will be thinkers who want to challenge us. But we don't need to be afraid of the challenge. We should welcome challenges to our ideas. It will help us to progress and to sharpen up our arguments. The important thing about Judaism is your ability to live it fully wherever you are. Alexandria has a great Jewish community which has responsibility for its own culture and legal life. The only thing it doesn't have is the physical land of Israel and the ability to offer sacrifices, but it has prayers and synagogues instead.
Tens of thousands of Jews like Shimon left Eretz Yisrael in the years before and after the destruction of the Second Temple. Whilst no single area of the diaspora had more Jews than the numbers of Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, the diaspora as a whole had far more Jews living in it. However, even after the terrible events of the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE and the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135 CE, the land of Israel remained at the centre of Jewish culture for another few generations. That's the end of the recording for Assignment 1 Part 2. There was one further recording for Assignment 1 Part 3, starting here.